just a kind of a slow, slow devaluation of the market, but do you think that this actually will pop at some point?
Yes. In fact, over the past 2 years, also what has happened is we've seen a tremendous increase in bankruptcies related to home mortgages, where people just cannot afford to make their housing payments any longer. And let me give you an example of something I'm talking about here, which would illustrate this. My best friend, his wife, had a marketing job where she was making pretty close to $100,000 a year working for a toy company called Fisher-Price Toys, which is a Buffalo company that was purchased by Mattel a few years back. She lost her job. The only job she could replace it with was a school teacher job, and she took about a 70 to 75% pay cut in doing so. Because of the former high income that this family had, they have a mortgage that is $1,800 per month. And they are in danger at this point of losing their house outright because they're finding, as the months transpire, bigger and bigger difficulty paying that $1,800 per month off.
Yeah.
And I had mentioned to him back when his wife lost that job, I said, you should dump your house because you're going to end up losing it at some point. And the type of situation that could happen if the worst case scenario does happen would be that you're talking about a 90% default in terms of 9 out of every 10 people, families losing their homes. About 6 years ago, I made the prediction because I did see this spiritually with my third eye, that and within the time frame leading up to 2012, we would see multiple families living in a single family home as a result of this collapse of the housing market.
That's pretty interesting. So, I mean, the question here is, of course, why is this happening? And the more important question is, I guess, is this allowed to happen for another reason? We've heard so much about the fact that, what we're going to talk about a little bit later about the North American Union, that there is a merging between the countries, and in order for this kind of transition to take place, there is the idea that this might have been kind of put together by think tanks out there that we have to get rid of what is known as the middle class in the U.S. and to kind of what do you call it, kind of stabilize, or not stabilize, but kind of make the leaps or the gaps between the countries more even. I'm talking about between Mexico and U.S. and the Canada now, of course. So do you think, Kent, that this is kind of allowed to happen at this point, or is there some other reason for this?
Yes, I look at this in the following way. This is both asset confiscation and also the ultimate plan or agenda that appears to me to be at play here behind the scenes, is the eventual removal of the right to own private property. And what a perfect way to do it than to have 90% of your people lose their homes.
Yeah.
because what's going to happen is the titles for these homes are going to be transferred back to the lending bank, and it's just going to create an exponentiated wealth increase in the elite sector of our economy. So yes, it is allowed to happen on purpose. And as you pointed out a moment ago, the Council on Foreign Relations has their hand in this, and whenever they're sniffing around any situation, it's not good for me and you, brother.
You're talking about this, the idea also about the value here, and this is something that I kind of want to bring up, because we could tie this, of course, again into the Federal Reserve System that so many people, still don't, know the truth about how that works and operates, even though, this many movies have been made on this subject. We have Aaron Russo, his latest one, of course, that goes into this, and many more, of course. But also talking about this kind of the false value system that exists right now, and this is kind of almost a tricky thing, because going into it, and when you kind of discover that the entire economic system, at least as it is right now over in the U.S., is kind of built on an illusion, basically. So kind of a crash of an illusion, kind of that would affect people in reality, so to speak, is pretty interesting and tricky subject. The question I guess I want to ask to you is, do you think that the root of this problem goes back to the Federal Reserve System, or can we even tie this back further to before the Federal Reserve System came into place? I mean, we had the economic crash back in the 20s, late 20s, and then in I think 1933, if I remember correctly, the Federal Reserve System was put in place, right?
The Federal Reserve came into being in 1913, I believe. 1913,
okay, yeah.
Yeah. So it actually had played a part in what we refer to as the Great Depression. And what I see happening in the next handful of years is going to make that look like a very small, minor event as compared to the way it's portrayed now as this earth-shattering economic upheaval in our past.
Yeah. Let's see here. You wrote, exactly, that the U.S. is hopelessly bankrupt. A condition has existed since March 1933, and I guess the kind of, I've heard this too, that the kind of there's an undercurrent of information going around that the U.S. kind of was bankrupt back in 1933. What can you tell us about that, Kent?
Yeah, a couple of significant events happened in 1933, which was on the tails of the Depression. And during the ending of the Depression is that they confiscated gold from private hands. And this was the generic, like bullion and that type of gold. And they're looking to do this again at this point. Just checking today, gold is $838 an ounce. So with the inverse relationship between gold and the value of the dollar, with this being $838 per ounce, that should give everyone an indication as to the general condition of the dollar right now, which is getting its butt kicked by the euro. And they're going to have to, at some point, dump this currency, the one we have in the U.S. at this point, because they can't keep inflating it at the current rate. They've even stopped reporting on a month-to-month basis the status of the M3 money supply, which is how much money they print. And this is above and beyond the gross domestic product. And this is why when, for instance, you go to the grocery store here in my neighborhood, you know, eggs and other commodities at the grocery store are increasingly expensive. Like from each visit, the price has been jumping. It's like $6 for a jar of pickles, which is, you know, very expensive and quite outrageous. And one of the first expressions of inflation usually does occur through the grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And, you know, again, this kind of, we could tie this back to, we could talk about how things actually were in you know, you were talking about kind of seizure of you know, houses or even land or whatever, or assets in different ways. This is kind of a more quiet version, I guess we could say, of what was happening in you know, over in the Soviet when they had their so-called revolution, you know, when so many of the Russians, you know, their assets were being taken from their houses, their land, and things like this. And in a way, I guess we could draw a kind of a comparison between the two, but the expression this time is you know, somewhat different, and it isn't, at least not yet, as radical as it was over there. But what you're saying here, if 9 out of 10 people potentially could lose their house, that's you know, that's a great tragedy, and a lot of upheaval, of course, would be a natural reaction to a thing like that, you know.
Yes, absolutely. That will cause social chaos in this country. And when you combine this with the tremendous influx of the illegal aliens from Mexico, you know, you have a situation which is ripe for complete civil war here. So we're in a very precarious position in many, many different ways.
Exactly. And
I also thought it was interesting, a comment that Alan Greenspan, the former longtime chairman of the Federal Reserve, made in 1966 when he was just an economist, and he was telling the truth at that point. This was before his involvement with the Federal Reserve, and he was a little more open to making honest statements. And he said, quote, "In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There's no safe store of value. If there were, the government would have to make its holding illegal, as was done in the case of gold. The financial policy of the welfare state requires that there be no way for the owners of wealth to protect themselves. This is the shabby secret of the welfare statists' tirades against gold. Deficit spending is simply a scheme for the confiscation of wealth."
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that we could also, I guess, tie into this discussion to get some perspective, whether or not, if we kind of go away from the idea that what is happening is you know, is bad, or, you know, for other people because of their agenda it's good, or whatever they consider this to be. But I mean, the bankers have set up the system from day one. Basically, it's their monetary system. I know that there was attempts, of course, when we talk about the U.S. In history, to kind of begin printing. We have the story of the greenbacks and all this, of course, to kind of go away from the Federal